I spoke to Michael Fallon, the Secretary of State for Defence, earlier on. He said Britain has backed Britain has backed the missile strike, on a Syrian airbase as an appropriate response to the chemical attacks by Bashar Assad. And I asked him why he was backing President Trump.
We're supporting it because we want to prevent the regime using chemical weapons against its own people in future and slaughtering children, as we saw in that appalling gas attack. This was a very limited but very appropriate response from the United States, targeting the airfield and the airplanes and the equipment that was used in this attack in order to deter the Syrian regime from doing anything like it again.
Did Mr. Trump have a conversation with the Prime Minister before this happened?
We've been in very close contact with the American government at all levels over the last couple of days. I've spoken to my opposite number, the Defence Secretary, and our Prime Minister is being kept informed of those discussions throughout.
Just for those people who do have their doubts, what makes you 100% sure that President Assad was responsible for this chemical attack?
Well, we've shared our assessment with the Americans who've done their own assessment, and we think it's highly likely that this was the regime. The regime has form in this area. It's used gas before against its own people, and it has continued to defy United Nations Security Council resolutions. And what's really important now is that we do deter the regime from carrying out further attacks in future. And that's the aim of this very limited, narrowly focused action the Americans took last night.
Which the Russians will not be best pleased with.
No, but the Russians have had every opportunity over the last 2 or 3 years to use their influence, and they have great influence over the regime, to use their influence to stop the regime attacking its own people, barrel bombing its own civilian population, using gas against its own people. You know, the Russians should be hanging their heads in shame.
Hanging their heads in shame?
Absolutely. They should be using their influence to bring this civil war to an end.
Would you like to see a regime change in Syria?
We've always made it clear that there is no long-term future for President Assad in Syria. Somebody who's bombed his own civilians, who's been gassing his own civilians. There's no future for him. On the contrary, we want Syria to move to a more democratic settlement in which all the different groupings in Syria can be properly represented.
Saddam Hussein gassed and killed his own civilians. We got rid of him. Look what happened next. You have the terrible strongman there. You get rid of the strongman, you have chaos. How do you make sure that that doesn't happen?
Well, we have democracy now in Iraq, however fragile it is, and we have Iraqi armed forces, thanks to our help, now beginning to push Daesh terrorists out of all their cities. Only Mosul is left, and enabling people to come back and live in freedom.
What happens next?
Well, we have
finally, in Syria, if you get rid of, in the long terms, that you said there's no future.
Well, we have to have the kind of government we've got in Iraq, which represents Shia and Sunni, can represent all the different factions. It's a fragile democracy in Iraq, I grant you that. But there is no future in Syria to be led by a dictator who's prepared to gas his own people.
The kind of government we have in Iraq, that's a fascinating debate in itself, and it's caused for some comment as well on text and on Twitter and on Facebook.